Puerto Rican political class is very happy to have the board because they have somebody to blame.
Which is when Promesa was being constructed, this Congressional Budget Office was required to make an estimate of the cost of this, and they came up with an estimate of about $340 million.
Nobody wants the situation to end. Everyone who's involved in the process likes the way it's going.
That process has been corrupted so badly. People were promoting Puerto Rico as the Singapore of Latin America.
You know, what is the Puerto Rico story that people should care about? My name is Jay Newman, and I'm the host of your Undermoney videocast, which is where we explore the linkages between money, power, politics, and business. And it's an enormous pleasure for me today to be with Cate Long, who is, Cate, I think it's fair to say that you are a polymath. Mm-hmm. You hold patents on the standardization and visualization of fixed income market data. Mm-hmm. You advised on the structure of Dodd-Frank. Mm-hmm. You've been a consult. You wrote for Reuters, and it was in your capacity as a writer at Reuters that you predicted the insolvency of Puerto Rico.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So you were really the canary in the coal mine for calling out the fact that Puerto Rico was functionally bankrupt. Mm-hmm. And now you founded something called the Puerto Rico Clearinghouse, which is a consultancy for bondholders and other stakeholders in Puerto Rico. And I'm fascinated by Puerto Rico. I don't really understand Puerto Rico. I know you do because you've been focused on it for at least a decade, and probably nobody knows more than you do. Cate, what is Puerto Rico? What are we doing there? You know, what is the Puerto Rico story that people should care about?
Well, thank you for having me, Jay. Appreciate it. The United States invaded Puerto Rico in 1898, and the Spanish government ceded the island to Puerto Rico, and it became a territory. It's governed under the U.S. Constitution as an independent entity that Congress has full control of, much like a District of Columbia. And the United States had a lot of success in the 40s helping industrialize the island, and it was done under Roosevelt in this program called Operation Bootstrap. Around that time, the current Constitution of Puerto Rico was approved by Congress, creating a tripartite structure of government, very much like we have in the United States. Puerto Rico did pretty well. There's been a lot of corporate tax benefits for U.S. multinationals to operate there. And on the basis of that, another industrialization they did pretty well through the 90s, at which time President Clinton, with Congress, sunset this corporate tax framework that had allowed this massive industrialization. And around that time, it sunset in the late 2000s. The government of Puerto Rico just started borrowing to fill gaps for tax revenues that they had collected. And they also, of course, lost employment, so they lost that source of revenue. And then you get to basically 2012, when I first picked up the bond documents for an issue they were doing. They just ran deficits on a regular basis. And, most states, there's 49 states have balanced budget statutes or requirements. Vermont does not, oddly. But Puerto Rico also has that requirement in their constitution, but they just disregarded it. And the Puerto Ricans pay very little, almost no federal income tax, unless you're a federal employee working there. But they received this large social transfers from the federal government. They got to this point where they just said they couldn't pay any of this debt that they'd racked up. So that was 2015, and then Congress stepped in 2016.
But you flagged this in 2012.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, and what happened? And if I'm right, people really came down hard on you for calling this out.
Yeah. Well, So when you issue bonds, or at least in the municipal market, you have to do a backward-looking financial disclosure, usually about 7 years, 7 years. And when I read, when I studied the bond documents, I could see they were consistently running these deficits and doing nothing, really, almost nothing to correct them. So I just said that. I said, look, these people, the practice of the government there was just to spend beyond what their revenue was. And the governor at the time sent his minions to attack me and various, other parties in the media. I didn't really care. I mean, I work for Reuters. They defend you when this stuff happens. So, and then in 2014, Barron's wrote an article kind of nuking the bonds, and which, it's important to understand. Debt issued in Puerto Rico has triple tax exemption across the entire United States. So if you're a high net worth person in California or New York, you can buy the bonds and get tax exempt income. So the bonds were pretty widely held. So,
And yet nobody noticed that the government was simply borrowing and borrowing and borrowing, and until all of a sudden they couldn't pay anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think, in the investment banks, the guys that are on a trading desk and the guys that, do the banking and manage accounts, so sales guys, I think that was pretty clear to most of them. So there's 19 classes of debt. You see some of the weaker debt trading off through that period. And I know guys have told me that we're big holders. When I made the call in 2012, a lot of them started moving out very quietly out of the bonds. If you hold the bonds, you don't want to set up a big red flag, right, for everybody else out to run out ahead of you.
Yeah. So, but why did it? I guess I don't quite understand why the federal government got involved at all. Because the federal government, thanks in part to your efforts, drafted something called Promesa, which is a statute that intervenes in Puerto Rico. But why did the federal government even feel the need to do that? Why shouldn't Puerto Rico have just sorted out its own debt problems by itself?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. And I was asked by the staff of the House Natural Resources Committee to help whip Republican votes to get it out of committee. And I can remember a number of conversations with staff of House members in the Republican study group, which is like the very conservative, at the time was basically the most conservative group in the House. And they were like, just let it all burn down, just let it all collapse. And they need to figure out how to pick up the pieces. That was very much the minority view. And I was shocked at the time, actually, how radical that was. But I think in hindsight, that probably would have been the better approach. Instead of what we ended up with in Promesa, which, a lot of people were involved in helping negotiate that law. But what we ended up with was an oversight board appointed by the president with nominations from leaders of the House and Senate, who have essentially control of the budget and what we call a fiscal plan, which was kind of a forward-looking 5-year plan for what expenses and revenues will be. And that's where the games have been. There are a lot of games played with projecting revenues, projecting cash flows from the government for Medicaid, for example.
So just to, help people with some acronyms. So Promesa is the Puerto Rican Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act. And under Promesa, there's something called the Financial Oversight and Management Board, FOMB, which is the board you're talking about that basically runs Puerto Rico's finances. And nothing happens in Puerto Rico in terms of finances without the approval of the board. So the board, essentially, Puerto Rico's intervened, much the way New York City was, and to some extent still is intervened.
Right. So you have the framework of New York City bankruptcy. The state imposed a control board in terms of the finances. You have the more direct comparison to the DC control board, which Congress, similar to Puerto Rico, has direct control of or oversight of the District of Columbia. And in the case of the board Congress installed for DC, they had budget authority. They had much broader authority even than what the Oversight Board has in Puerto Rico. There's kind of a standard model, and we've had other control boards. I mean, Detroit, there's many other examples in American history, but The issue with Puerto Rico is that, they've kind of been captured. This board, which are volunteers, unpaid volunteers, essentially, has been captured by the consulting class around it the lawyers, in my opinion. I wanted just to bring up one point, which is when Promesa was being constructed, this Congressional Budget Office was required to make an estimate of the cost of this board and restructuring the debt. And they came up with an estimate of about $340 million. And their estimate was based on Detroit, the amount of debt and pension liability in Detroit. And for Puerto Rico, we're basically at $1.5 billion now, and that doesn't include the creditor costs, because their legal costs are paid too. So all in, we're probably, I would say in the territory of about $2.4 billion now, and the CBO had estimated $340 million. So
that's just, you're talking about, that's just the cost of consultants. So McKinsey and
right, and attorneys, yes, attorneys,
and the lawyers, and $2.5 billion of expense.
Yeah. I mean, let me just say one other thing. But when we worked on constructing Promesa, I was promoted, and it was adopted that we take the framework used in sovereign restructurings, which is, sovereign nations, when they, as you know, don't have legal frameworks, but they use a consensual method of, rounding up enough creditors based on whatever the legal documents are to get consensus to cram the holdouts. And hello. And so I said, well, why don't we just import that as part of this process instead of just having a Chapter 9 process or a Chapter 11 process where all this stuff has to go through the courts. And so they did that. Congress incorporated what we call Title VI of Promesa, which is essentially where the board, as representative of the debtor, gets enough consensus among a class of creditors, and then they present a consensual deal to the court. The idea was that almost all the debt classes would go through Title VI, and instead the vast majority have gone through what we call Title III, which is a traditional corporate style bankruptcy or municipal style debt restructuring within a legal framework. So that's been the real problem. Creditors have stood by ready to negotiate from even prior to Promesa being enacted by Congress. And the board, led by, I would say Proskauer, their legal reps, their primary legal reps, and then several members of the board, including Judge Arthur Gonzalez, who was a former bankruptcy judge, have just, decided they really had no interest in any of the requirements that Congress imposed through the statute. So
Puerto Rico got into trouble because local politicians wanted to borrow money and spend for, their own political agendas. They ran into trouble. Congress, for, to me, inexplicable reasons, decided to jump in and regulate the whole process.
Right.
Rather than abide by the rules established by Congress, the board decided to do its own thing.
Exactly.
And 6 years later, Puerto Rico, it seems like it's awash in cash. They have plenty of money. They have plenty of federal money.
Tons.
There's no sign that this board is ever going to end.
Yeah, so the trigger in the statute for the board to end is 4 years of balanced budgets, and there's some disagreement whether debt service has to be a component of that. And the second is this exact wording is access to the market at reasonable rates. So as an issuer, Puerto Rico needs to be able to come to market and issue bonds at market levels, essentially. And I pulled some of the trading data for the restructured bonds, and they're trading at like 660 or something for 10-year paper, and New York is trading like 340. So they're miles from having, access at reasonable rates. And that's on bonds, bear in mind, that's on bonds that were restructured within the bankruptcy and have a court order that, a mandamus almost essentially laid on top of them, that if they don't pay, the creditor can go to court and force the payment. So the idea that they would come to market without that kind of court-ordered guarantee, I think is, we're a decade at least away, maybe more.
A decade?
Yeah. Well, the thing you have to remember is the municipal market is extremely conservative. We're multiple times more conservative than the sovereign market or the corporate market. And even to get rated, right, to even get market access, the issuer has to get rated. Puerto Rico has to have a rating. None of the rating agencies has rated it in over 5 years. To get rated, you have to have current financials. They're several years behind filing their audited financials, which has gotten worse since the bankruptcy began.
Whoa, wait a second. So the board, why would they not have financials? I mean, it's a
That's part of the grift.
It's a small.
Yeah, no, it's part of the grift. I think
What do you mean part of the grift?
Yeah, so
Well, we haven't talked about corruption in Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
That's maybe this is the time to start talking about it.
I think, a little bit in our back and forth prior to this, the premise of bankruptcy is that you have a process that sort of illuminates what capacity the debtor has to pay their debts, right? And that process has been corrupted so badly in the Puerto Rico bankruptcy. One, the last financials are over 3 years old, audited financials. The fiscal plans that the board controls have been widely inaccurate in terms of representing what the revenues are and the expenses are of the government. And the primary example of that is they filed a plan of adjustment for the major portion of debt, the Commonwealth. I don't want to get too geeky here, but in that plan, they said that the federal government would essentially reduce Medicaid funding to the Puerto Rican government from $3 billion a year to $400 million a year. So that $2.6 billion just evaporated out of the fiscal plan. So based on that, they said they couldn't pay any of the debts. 10 days after the court approved that plan of adjustment, suddenly that $2.6 billion just reappeared in the fiscal plan. They certified a new fiscal plan that put the $2.6 billion back. So now they have just an unbelievable amount of cash. And the latest was Monday this week, the government and the Oversight Board announced they're giving $475 million to the employees as bonuses, government employees.
Whoa, wait a second. Help me out with this.
Yeah.
In which parallel universe do government employees get bonuses?
There's no government in the United States that gives bonuses. There's no state and local government. I can't speak for the federal government, but there's no state or local government that gives bonuses to their employees. So that's an oddity.
How does the board, whose idea is this? I mean, how does the board even begin to approve something so outlandish?
Any plan of adjustment for a debtor is a series of compromises between parties that are competing for a limited pool of resources or assets. In this case, they artificially constricted the amount upfront of resources through this Medicaid gambit, whatever. But they said to the employees, the unions, the public unions representing the employees, we will stop accruing pensions for your employees, but we'll give you bonuses. We'll give you 25% of surplus, cash surplus that happens every year. And that was the deal they cut. They also gave the employees raises and didn't lay anyone off. So net, they're out. They come out ahead, way ahead. Unfortunately, it's a little hard to explain in a very condensed conversation like this what happened over 2 years of litigation and kind of just manipulation of the process. But the outcome right now is that bondholders, the other thing that happened this week was the lowest tier of bonds in the government got 4 cents on the dollar. So you had what we call appropriation debt. You had the lowest class in the debt stack get 4 cents on the dollar. You get the public employees getting this $475 million in bonuses. In the meantime, it's not very prudent. And I hate to make it sound so complex, but it is complex. But the outcome, I think, once we stand back a year from now, we'll say this was an impossible outcome given what Congress outlined in the statute.
And there's no supervision of the board or the Puerto Rican government?
Yeah, so when Republicans held the House, they did when Promesa was enacted. And through 2018, they held the House. There was pretty pretty active supervision of the board in terms of staying true to the terms of the statute. When control flipped in the House, basically the Democrats were, kind of happy the way things were going, that bondholders were getting really crammed and that, pensions were paid in full and, all this extra cash was going to employees. So, basically there's been almost no supervision in the last couple of years from Congress. And it was very interesting to me to see who would take the House and the Senate in this election that we just had yesterday, because Republicans, I'm sure, will be very interested in, having supervision, having some reporting on what's happening here. Democrats, no, not so much.
So just speculating here, right? You have a board that presumably people like serving on the board. So you have this kind of institutional imperative. Even though they're not being paid, they enjoy doing it for whatever reason.
Yeah.
You have the professional staff of the board that are paid very well to run this process and keep running this process. You have lawyers, you have consultants. I've heard a lot about McKinsey, about Brattle Group and conflicts of interest and how much money they're being paid. They don't want anything to end.
Definitely
Presumably
not.
the Puerto Rican political class is very happy to have the board because they have somebody to blame for anything that they can't do or don't want to do. This is like an impossible puzzle of institutional imperatives that people just are never going to want to change and never going to want to solve the problem of Puerto Rico's access to capital markets.
I agree. I mean, I think essentially Puerto Rico had this devastating hurricane 5 years ago. And as a consequence, the federal government is giving them $80 billion to reconstruct. And then COVID came and Puerto Rico and all the states, of course, got this big slug of money, cash. So they don't need market access. I mean, really, like when you look at it in terms of need for, CapEx, they don't have a need, which means they won't be able to demonstrate they have market access.
So so nobody wants the situation to end. Everyone who's involved in the process likes the way it's going.
Right, except creditors, right? Yeah.
Except creditors and
right.
They don't have really, they advocate for themselves, but there's what can creditors do for themselves? Can they go to court?
We've been in court a lot, yeah. The litigation has gone on since 2014. Initially, electric utility defaulted on their debt, and Puerto Rico created this ersatz restructuring law, which was challenged in district court, and that ended up going to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it was struck down in all those courts. And then when Promesa was enacted, there was a stay. There was an automatic stay that was put in place. And then once the stay was over, the litigation started, and then the board filed these petitions in the bankruptcy court, which put a stay. But there's been I didn't count, but maybe there's been 100 appeals to the circuit. The docket for the main case is at like 22,000, There's been maybe like 150 adversary cases. And then it's gone, various issues involved in the bankruptcy have gone up to the U.S. Supreme Court maybe like 15 times. So 15
times the Supreme Court?
Yeah, because there's different issues that don't necessarily relate to bondholders, but involve separation of powers between the board and the government, or unions, or unions are litigating about their treatment of their pensions, or rights that they had prior to the bankruptcy and stuff. It's a real feeding trough for the attorneys and stuff. I mean, I heard at one point like Proskauer sends all their summer associates down to Puerto Rico to get broken in and stuff.
I'm really speechless, but I'm actually speechless because the story is just it's just such a broken process. What would you do from here to fix it? Or maybe it never gets fixed. Maybe, we live with the FOMB forever.
Right. And I think, the baseline here for any state or local government, federal government, is are they, providing what the citizens need? And that was tossed out, a part of the statute, Promesa, that requires the board to identify essential services. And clean up the rest of the government, which is filled with political appointees and things that programs or offices or agencies that may have made sense 15 years ago, but just don't really function now. And the board has consistently refused since the beginning of the process to do that, to identify what is really essential to running the Puerto Rican government efficiently, and then providing the services the citizens need. Basically become a way to maintain the government that's there with the shadow government of consultants and board staff that do a lot of the financial reporting. And then this cadre of consultants and attorneys that litigate and bill every month for whatever they're doing. But again, I think, Jay, the key for this when we look at Detroit or Stockton or Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, when we look at any of these governments, we want to say, did the bankruptcy help make the government leaner and more efficient and provide better services to the people? And in the case of Puerto Rico, it's absolutely the case that it has not.
And it sounds like that's primarily the case because the board isn't doing its job.
The board is focused on beating up creditors, on bondholders. That's what they see that their job almost entirely is.
So not being responsible for getting Puerto Rico back on its feet financially for the benefit of the Puerto Rican people, just having it. I saw something online about it's the guy who's the president of the board, David Skeel, who's a law professor, I think at Penn.
Yeah,
he has this kind of spiritualist view of the bankruptcy law, which I find hard to reconcile with law at all. Is he fundamentally anti-creditor? Is that what's infected as you said, infected the whole board so it can't function because they can't see straight past the debt?
Yeah. I think David is light on understanding the law and heavy on wanting to infuse the bankruptcy system with some Christian overtones that make it okay to unfairly attack creditors. And again, I think the process of bankruptcy is for the debtor to honestly and forthrightly disclose what their capacity to pay is, and then to divvy up that pie in the most fair way. And the board, led by David Skeel, has repeatedly obscured what the assets of the Commonwealth are, Puerto Rico are, allowed the financials to be years late because it shows those financials, when they come out, much greater capacity to pay debts. And I think his religious argument is undercut by the fact he just disregards the primary principles of what the bankruptcy process is. It would be great if the whole world could just wave away the debts, right? Because Puerto Rico is not unique. The United States, many U.S. states, many U.S. foreign governments have massive debts that have to be dealt with. But I think in all of those cases, it's a more fair approach to say realistically, what is the true capacity of that debtor to pay? And when the Commonwealth, this big chunk of the Commonwealth debt was being litigated in last year, some of the bond insurers forced discovery, right? They forced discovery on physical assets of the Commonwealth. The Puerto Rican government owns hundreds of commercial buildings that had been built over time in the earlier times for this industrialization push. They hid that. They said, essentially, we've never really collected any information on that. Okay, hard to believe. The bond insurance, okay, whatever. The bond insurance.
They're collecting rents, presumably, right?
Yeah. None of that was really accessible, or they fought endlessly to, make sure that was obscured. The bond insurer also pushed for disclosure of pension liabilities because it's never been clear. The claim has always been the pension liability is $50 billion, but nobody's ever documented that. When I started looking at Puerto Rico, the pension liability was like $32 billion. Suddenly it was like $50 billion. We had many instances of deceased people getting pensions, people that were never really employed getting pensions, but they refused discovery on any of that. And, that to me, wow. Yeah. So, but again, that goes back to the defending a bloated, inefficient government, right? you hate your.
Well, and it sounds like flat out corrupt government.
Yeah, I mean, that would have been a perfect process to clean up, where a lot of the grift is in the Puerto Rican government, is to say, or what I kept advocating for, is to do what Ohio does and California and many other states, which is put the pensions online. In those places, you can go online and look up by name, by the amount of pension. There's a database fully open to the public, and that helps taxpayers in those places understand what the pension liability is, but it's also the easiest way to clean it up.
And you can see what everybody's being paid, and it's completely transparent. That would have been the most obvious thing for the board to insist upon, and not just, your point about the assets not being inventoried is outrageous. But I want to go back to your point I want to go back to corruption, but first I want to ask you a question about this capacity to pay, because in the sovereign space, over the last 25, 30 years, it's become anathema to inquire over a sovereign's capacity, right? It's like the IMF and the World Bank and the G7 and the EU come in and say, it doesn't matter what they can pay. We're not treating this like a commercial situation. We're just going to tell you, the private creditors, what you are going to get paid. And that's it. Take it or leave it. And that has been the approach. So I'm surprised and not surprised that there's no rigorous conversation about the capacity of Puerto Rico to pay all of its stakeholders, and then having a negotiation with everyone at the table as to who gets what.
That's how it was set up, right? That's how the statute was set up, was that prior to any litigation or petitions being filed in the court, bankruptcy petitions, that the audited financials would be brought up to date. They would identify essential services and, clean up a lot of the just grift that's in the government. And they would, make all this information available to creditors. And then everyone could sit down. And none of that happened. They just decided they didn't want to approach it that way. So here we are at the end, near the end of the process. And, bondholders have been, really wrecked, basically.
Well, you say it's the end of the process, but it sounds like it's never going to end. And it smells to me, just hearing this story, like we need a special prosecutor. We need someone to go in and really figure out who's doing what to whom, where money's going missing, who's cutting what deals. I think there's a big question is whether the board itself is doing its job, and whether there's obviously they're indemnified, but maybe they're not indemnified if they're not doing the job properly.
Well, so again, Congress is Congress is the parent in this situation. The board itself can only be members of the board by the president for cause. Cause is not defined in the statute. Wouldn't surprise me sometime in the future we have a look back and a reconciliation of what this process is. I've been, collecting documents, and I have, drafts of reports for Congress and stuff. To keep up with it on a regular, ongoing basis is just beyond the capacity of most people, and certainly beyond the capacity of congressional staff. I know even the Congressional Research Service has written a number of reports, but they stopped about 2 years ago just because it got too complicated. So it's
when things are not working well and they get complicated, and then the people in charge make them more and more complicated, that is usually a sign of some inherent corruption, right?
Yeah.
Whether financial or political, but it's just because systems that devolve into that sort of chaos, there's usually some underlying cause and rationale and logic to it. It's obviously it's the undermoney, my favorite word, of who's getting what from whom, and whether it's some cash or political favors or pension benefits or bonuses. But where's the undermoney here?
Well, we have a direct issue of McKinsey now, who is the primary consultant to the Oversight Board, having direct conflicts of interest of representing parties that are, in legal terms, have adverse interest to the debtor, because they have clients that have major stakes in some of these restructurings. The last big restructuring now is the electric utility, and McKinsey has had the parents of the company that have the transmission and distribution privatization contract as clients. There's some issue of what happened there, and then it's unclear yet, but whether they have a client relationship with New Fortress Energy, which is the firm that allegedly has been given the contract to privatize the generation assets, the electric generation assets. That could be, depending on where that all plays out, could be explosive because, if there was some backroom dealing here in terms of McKinsey tipping off these parties in the process or giving them information that gave them an advantage in the process, I mean, it's major. It's really major. The U.S. trustee is now reviewing the disclosures of McKinsey. When the Title III court, the Judge Swain appointed the mediation judge for the electric utility debt negotiations, the mediation lead, who is the former bankruptcy judge, Shelley Chapman, she filed a motion with the court and said, really the board should get rid of McKinsey and get someone else to be their advisor for this process.
And how long ago did that happen?
That would have been like 2.5 months ago. So,
and has the board taken any?
No, the board refused.
Has the board taken any action to remove McKinsey?
No, the board has not. I mean, it has to be understood, let me explain too, that the lead attorneys for the board, Proskauer, have also represented McKinsey in other conflict of interest litigation that the McKinsey has against J. Alex. So Proskauer, who is the main attorney for the board, also has represented McKinsey in other conflict litigation. When the board wrote the initial contract with McKinsey and then all the amendments to that, I guess it's the standard McKinsey contract, but it says in that contract that McKinsey has the right to have conflicts and to have
No. Tell me that's not true.
I'll send you the language, but McKinsey contract says that they will often represent parties with adverse interests in restructurings or whatever, and that they've walled off people. They have some kind of Chinese wall in the organization that makes sure that, there's no information going back and forth.
So they have a Chinese wall for information, but all the money goes to the same bottom line.
Yeah. And, having been in the bond business for a long time around banks, dealers, Chinese walls are, you can take them for what you want. They work on a formal basis, but informally they don't work that well. So
when you go down to the pub after work and you're letting your hair down, who knows what gets said?
Right. Well, here, just add one more layer on top of the McKinsey current story. There's a corporate attorney in Puerto Rico who's the nephew of one of the federal bankruptcy judges down there who's been litigating to get more discovery on McKinsey's conflicts with both New Fortress and Luma, these Canadian companies that have the transmission and distribution privatization contract. And he filed a motion recently for discovery because he said in his court filing that he had a number of witnesses that had worked in the government, current and prior, that could testify to the conflicts that McKinsey has.
So I'm sure I've read somewhere that there are some irregularities in the process of how Luma was selected. Let's go discuss what Luma is for a second, because I think it's important to understand it. They've been hired to handle power transmission and handle the grid in Puerto Rico. Is that right?
Yeah.
That's not going very well, as I understand it.
No, when you have electric utility, a lot of times the generation, making electricity is separated from actually running the grid, right? So you make the power and then you put it out and manage the grid. So in Puerto Rico, they split the utility into two. They put out a request for proposals for the transmission. Honestly, I don't know if there was any irregularities in the process. I know that major U.S. utilities bid to do that work. And I'm talking operational, utilities that run large comparable systems. And Luma, this consortium of 3 Canadian firms, won because they underbid these other firms by like 30 million or something. I think the contract total is like $1.2 billion, and so they underbid the other guys by like 30 million. The group that won this consortium is 2 Canadian and a Houston company that really are not system operators. They're electric system builders, but they don't really have experience operating. And also, it's really a startup. I mean, the way I view Luma, it's just a startup company, right? It's not like, electric utility like PG&E here in Oklahoma that's been run for 50 or 60 years, and they know what they're doing. It's just a bunch of guys that came out of these various companies, and now they're trying to take over this whole beat up electric utility. When they finally got some data, some statistical data in terms of operations, they ended up being worse than the public system that they were replacing. So that's pretty damning, basically. They have various explanations for that. They were rebuilding more efficient, more thoroughly than they had in the past, whatever. But so the performance of the grid went down once Lumen took over.
So I think, when we write the memo to the special prosecutor, we'll put this on the list to kind of figure out, what really went on and what the decision-making process was.
Yeah. Well, the other key thing, let me just point out there, is that the public employees of the electric utility were given the option to either go with Luma, this new privatization consortium, or go into the central government. And what they ended up, 2,000 employees just went into make work jobs in the central government. So you had guys that were like linemen on the electric utility. I saw one of them, like 8 of them were put in the public radio agency for the government.
So we can add to the list 2,000 employees that were given no-show jobs?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And when they do this restructuring, I'm not privy to what the negotiations are, but that was one of my main issues. Like, who's paying the pensions for these 2,000 guys that just, have no-show jobs, essentially?
But I thought they didn't get pensions; they just get bonuses.
No. So this is the pensions for the electric utility were separate from the Commonwealth, the central government, handled separately.
Forgive my confusion.
It's not complicated enough to handle it the same way. So it's being handled separately within the bankruptcy of the electric utility.
It sounds like, from what I've heard, a lot of the people who are involved in this process, whether it's the consultants or the lawyers or the board members, are touting the idea that this Promesa process and the FOMB are working great, and they should be exported to other states that are in trouble. And I think you've told me there are 4 biggies that have parlous finances. So it's Connecticut, New Jersey, Illinois, and Kentucky. If we're incredibly unlucky, they'll be able to sell Congress that the Puerto Rican model actually works. Is there even any possibility of that?
Those 4 states, the bad boys of the municipal market, do have significant unfunded pension liabilities. So they have very similar profile in that regard. They all file their financials on time, unlike Puerto Rico, who's, as I said, like several years behind. So we can see in real time, or more closer to real time, what the financial condition is. I think that those states, having seen the control taken away from the governor of Puerto Rico and the legislature, may have second thoughts. They may find it very attractive to have a restructuring process, but the idea that they were just going to be, neutered essentially by Congress, I don't think would fly. I don't think would fly. And I think Congress, when they learn what the full story of Puerto Rico is in terms of the treatment of creditors and, like these bonuses for employees, are going to find, contrary to even what Democrats thought that the statute should do. So I think that they're definitely, like David Skeel touts this. There's other board members that tout it, like this is some miracle cure for indebted states. But I think when you get down to it, there will be significant opposition and documented opposition to what the approach was.
I'm wondering what the solution is, and whether you can just obviously the board presumably could decide their job is done, or can they? Or does it require Congress to say you're going to wrap this thing up in 6 months or 8 months or 9 months? And everybody goes home. I'm curious, how many staff are there at the board level? It sounds like there are probably a couple of hundred.
No, I think at the board level, there's about 75 internal. But
I
think
75.
Yeah, but when you count what the consultants have and stuff, it's in the hundreds. I think that the question in my mind really is how much responsibility have they transferred from the internal board staff and consultants in terms of financial reporting to government employees, because they at least are current on their payables, for example. I mean, it used to be when Puerto Rico went into bankruptcy, the joke was, at the end of the year, they would put all the invoices or their payables into a drawer somewhere and just call the thing balanced. So at least, I will give them credit. I will give all the parties credit now for, we don't have this drawer problem, right? End of the year drawer problem. But, how much has the actual mechanics of, the accounting and auditing mechanics of keeping track of the expenses of the government, how much of that has been transferred to government employees? And I don't think it's enough. I think that would be the impediment, or that would be what I would tell Congress. That's the thing you got to make sure. Once the board is removed, that there's sufficient capacity in the government to keep the finances straight. And I can't believe we're saying this, 5 or 6 years in. I mean, that should have happened year one. I mean, some people advocated, Jay, for I had accounting people just say, look, just have the board has subpoena power. They should just go in and take all the books and just take full control. And instead, we've had this sort of iterative process where, the consultants do a lot of the work and then the government, employees do some of the work. And, that's the heart of running a government, right? You take in revenue and you have expenses and you keep track of the expenses and, there's some controls in place and stuff. And
I think to your point earlier about transparency, I mean, the board could have amassed all this information. The fights over discovery should never have happened. The board should have said, yes, of course, we're going to get all that information. We're going to make it all public. We're going to put it online. And, and then we'll, let's crowdsource the best ideas for Puerto Rican finances.
Well, I think that beyond my complaints as, on the creditor's side, I think that the people of Puerto Rico would benefit tremendously from that. They have viewed their own government as deeply corrupt and operating mainly to serve this political class. And the more access you give citizens to what the actual operations are, I think it helps build confidence. And, so that we've missed a real big opportunity on that basis too. Again, back to the pensions, how Ohio or the other states handle pensions, New Jersey, they put their pensions online. Many states also have what they call open book system, where they have real-time checkbook, which any citizen can go in and look on a daily basis who they're writing checks to, the tax revenues coming in and stuff. So all the technology's out there. It doesn't require having all these, layers of expensive, high-class consultants to do this. There, we have multiple examples of it happening on a very simple basis across America. And yet, the approach has been year after year, just keep, all these very expensive, outsiders involved in the process. And I would urge, I had urged Congress at one point to, for example, predicate federal funding on them implementing some of these systems, this pension database thing and the open checkbook. That's a little radical at the time it was a little radical. It might make more sense now.
Well, I think it does. It sounds like it does make sense. I mean, you have what you're pointing out is that there are best practices that have been implemented in most of the states. So we know how to run a transparent, open system, but somehow Puerto Rico is allowed to exist in a separate universe of opacity. If assuming Congress takes note of this, what has to happen? They have to basically create a whole new board to regulate the board?
Well, that's not going to happen. No, that's not going to happen.
Well, what is going to happen?
Well, if I were the queen and the Congress asked me what to do, I would say, create.
Which they do. Congress often asks Cate Long what it should do.
Okay.
So that's not implausible.
Okay. So I would say let's create a runway, right? Like a 2 or 3 year runway, and let's get some of this stuff in place, just like we've been discussing here, the pension database, the open checkbook. The government has to decide, they have still like 110 agencies or something in a government for 3.2 million people. Make it 40 or 30. You guys decide, but clean this up, right? And if you don't, we're going to start docking everyone's salary or something, put some kind of whip in place. And then the board goes out of business. And the thing, Jay, with the restructuring is all the bond docs give creditors right to go back to court to enforce payment. So we don't need the board to keep the creditors paid. And the pensions are pretty much in the same way. They've been embedded in the plan of adjustment. So we don't need the board to make sure the pensions are paid. Sort of critical boundaries that one would look at in terms of running a government are pretty much embodied in these restructuring agreements that the court has blessed. So, I would just say to Congress, you guys give them some milestones here and then dissolve the board. The contra argument to that is that in New York City, the board that was created when New York City couldn't pay its debt in the 80s is still operating. Most people don't know that, but the board is still operating and has authority over the budget and stuff. So history in many instances keeps these boards kind of operating way past their what's necessary. There's a certain inertia for that. In the case of Puerto Rico, I think it'll start to become more evident that the board is not really contributing much to what's going on, and instead is just spending time litigating and creating opportunities to attack people in the courts.
So as we're and this is kind of mind-bending stuff for a sovereign, much less something that should function like an American state,
right?
Some level of transparency, because Puerto Rico has a lot of advantages. I mean, it's Puerto Ricans are American citizens. Mm-hmm. They've got a terrifically favorable tax regime.
Right.
I have a bunch of friends who have moved to Puerto Rico to run their hedge funds.
Right.
Because it's a very attractive place to be. It's also a beautiful place, mm-hmm. and a place that, admittedly, like many places in the Caribbean, there are weather issues, but mm-hmm. people deal with those.
Right.
But what I'm struggling with is this is a place that ought to be attracting a lot of investment and a lot of interest. Puerto Rico.
Yeah. So when Promesa was being created, and for some period of time after, people were promoting Puerto Rico as the Singapore of Latin America. It has every advantage to become Singapore, in the sense that the U.S. legal framework is extant there. The U.S. bankruptcy system is there. They have this odd crossover where international banks can locate there, and it used to be much easier, but get access to the Fed wire, the Fed clearing system. Every benefit there, so that you have to ask yourself, why aren't companies flocking to move their business there? And they're not. And even with this controversy between the United States and China, we should see a lot more pharmaceuticals moving, or building facilities down there to replace stuff that they're sourcing in China now. We're not seeing it. So you have to ask yourself, has this process created a fiscally responsible government, which is what the statute requires, and an investment environment that induces companies to come there and invest? And we're not. I think the proof's in the pudding, really.
Yeah, your point about the pharmaceuticals, I think, is really worth emphasizing, because it's mm-hmm. for decades it's been a very attractive place to cite pharmaceutical manufacturing because mm-hmm. of the essentially no tax regime, and mm-hmm. especially if we're worried about reshoring pharmaceuticals from China and India, Puerto Rico is the perfect place, and yet it's not happening.
And so in that sense, I'm not a pharma person, but as I understand it, takes 5 years for the FDA to approve a new lab. So you have a long ramp, you have a long lead time. But, that just suggests they should be more active in getting some of this stuff established in Puerto Rico. And even if they just built on the facilities they have, the pharma companies have been down there over 60 years. They have a very long history with the government, and they're kind of the shadow, operators in terms of the system down there. They have these very preferential tax treatment, which was not affected in the bankruptcy. They didn't give up anything for the bankruptcy. Yeah, no, we have individuals like you're saying, folks, in hedge funds locating there. We have, some banking entities that have like Latin American connections going there because of the international banking laws. They had also another carve out for insurance companies. So we had a couple insurers that do reinsurance, but they compete with Bermuda and Bahama, right? They're not, that's not realistic. So
so it should be. So what we're saying is Puerto Rico should be some combination of Singapore, Bermuda, and New York.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
And yet it's Puerto Rico, and nobody even thinks about investing money there.
Right. So if you want to use that as the framework to judge the efforts of the board, I think you would say they've very much come up short, because there's not any big surge of investment activity there. Jobs have, employment's increased, but a lot of that is this federal money that came into.
Is the reality that we're discussing so different from the reality that they're seeing?
The board's entire premise for evaluating their work is how hard they hit bondholders. It's like this public finance corp debt I mentioned that was settled this week for 4 cents. They consider that an enormous victory. And they believe, I think, that shows that they benefited the Puerto Rican people. Well, if that's if your benchmark is how hard you can hit your current creditors, then they've done an exceptional job. If the benchmark, which is what Congress imposed, is treat your current creditors properly and get market access, they've failed. Just look at how the bonds trade, the restructured bonds. I don't think they really care, honestly. I don't think they really care.
Cate, is there anything you're optimistic about in terms of what might happen in Puerto Rico?
Yeah, well, so when Promesa was being constructed, the guys that were writing the statute asked me, asked all of us involved, what do you think should be in here? And I said, well, look, I think the number one thing is you need to have them put all the government contracts online, the text of them. Prior to that, they would put like the name of the company or the nonprofit and the amount of the contract. And they were like, yeah, sure. So the Oversight Board delayed it for a couple of years, but now all the government contracts are online. And what we have is the Puerto Rican journalists using that database to match up government contracts with donations, political donations, and cross-referencing to the Secretary of State database that shows when corporations were incorporated. So we have this really great tool now for local journalists to, expose essentially these rogue corporations that were getting established to get government contracts. And, I don't know how many billions of dollars went out the back door, but that was a very established process. In the days of COVID, there was an example of this company that just incorporated and then suddenly got a $35 million contract from the government to provide COVID tests that were allegedly coming from Australia. And, it was just some guys that knew the governor. They put a stop to it. The journalists put a stop to it. And I thought that was a tremendous win. I would say things like that. That's what I'm optimistic about. I'm hopeful that all this federal money that's going down there to rebuild things will actually create infrastructure that helps the economy and helps the people. But we'll see how much of that really gets used in infrastructure properly.
So, Cate, I know that we've covered a lot of ground, but we haven't even really touched the level of detail and complexity that you've been dealing with for the last decade. What have we missed in our conversation that people should know about Puerto Rico, about the possibility of investing in Puerto Rico, about the board?
Well, let me just go back slightly to this issue of pharma receiving these incentives, tax incentives. And Congress, the other thing I had asked Congress is to or put in the statute is to have some transparency on these tax incentives. So now the government has to write a report every year and make it public. And, last one, I think they reported for fiscal 2020. We're in fiscal 23 now, but the last one was the report in 2020. They give out $21 billion of tax incentives. And the general fund for the central government is $10 billion. So they're giving out over 2 times the amount of revenue they're taking in the central government. So what I would say to anyone that wants to invest is, it's like an open door. You get connected to, the people in the know down there, and, these tax incentives are freely given out now. I mean, they used to be more freely given out. They used to be traded. They used to have a system where companies that didn't use all their tax incentive would trade it and get cash from other companies. They don't allow that now. But if you connect to the people in power, there are significant advantages there from a tax basis. The workforce itself is bilingual, most of them pretty highly educated, and I think the people of Puerto Rico are actually very warm and honest. If you can deal with kind of a rogue government, it's something to consider. I'm sure there's many places around the world like that, but it has the advantages of having the U.S. legal system, having open trade. You can use kind of Puerto Rico as a backdoor to import stuff and, kind of diddle with tariffs and stuff, re-import into the United States, maybe just take a raw material and do something slight to it or something. So I guess, I'm not that optimistic until the board leaves and the government is forced to stand on their own 2 feet and really execute and help, serve the people. So I think we're still a very long way from that.
Do you have a sense that there's going to be an appetite in Congress to deal with these issues and deal with the dysfunction of the board and the dysfunction of Puerto Rico?
Honestly, Jay, I think it comes down to, I don't know when you're broadcasting this, but if Republicans take the Senate, because I know Senator Grassley would be very concerned with this stuff. He raised issues as Promesa was being constructed that are still unanswered, which relate to pensions and transparency of government finances and different stuff like that. And now that we've had these, this major preference to benefit government employees with, cash and salaries and pensions, and then massively haircut bondholders, I think he'll be very interested in that. And then we also have the additional issue of some of the court rulings that the district court made, Judge Swain, related to special revenue debt. And there's some areas within the bankruptcy code that need to be elucidated a little bit more finely by Congress, because her rulings were adverse to what the intent of Congress has been. I wish I could be more positive. Sorry.
Well, it's a bit discouraging.
Again, just let me say, Jay, if the real finances of the government had been exposed and there was no money to pay, I think, creditors are big boys, right? You can deal with this. But instead, what we've had is this endless hiding, obscuring of whether it's real assets or what pension liabilities are, cash on hand, what Medicaid is going to, what level Medicaid is going to come into the government. All that was in my view, intentionally obscured. And as a consequence, they dragged out this litigation and negotiation with creditors for years, and they were able to beat them down to low and low recoveries. And that's not what the process was intended to do.
Well, it's not. If you want to restore someone to creditworthiness, you don't achieve that by just beating up on lenders and investors. It's just it's counterproductive. So if you want to completely drive private finance out of a system, that's the best way to do it.
Yeah, and again, as I said earlier in the conversation, this market, the municipal market, is very conservative, right? It's not like hedge funds coming in and out of this debt. This is mom and pops buying this debt, right? And they need to see a rating. They need to see an investment grade rating. All the predicates that would restore market access have just been tossed to the side, really. So, but they don't need any cash. They don't need to come to market, so.
Well, Kate, I really appreciate the opportunity to understand this and hear your perspective, because I don't think there's anybody that understands the whole. Maybe no one has been involved as long as you have in observing and attempting to shape the process. And maybe you don't want credit for that at this point because Promesa has been so perverted, but it's it started off with great intentions and it's just evolved into a morass of incompetence and self-dealing. But maybe we should see what happens in the next month or two as Congress is formed and whether people take note. Maybe Senator Grassley is going to watch our conversation and decide that he wants to do something about it.
That would be great. I'm standing by.
Stranger things have happened, right?
Right.
Cate Long, thank you very, very much. It's just been an enormous pleasure, and thank you for spending the time.
Thank you, Jay.